Our next speaker is well known to FFRF audiences. She's a journalist and author whose writings appear in a variety of major publications. Katherine Stewart has spoken to us about her first book, written in 2012, The Good News Club, The Christian Right's Stealth Assault on America's Children. She's also spoken to us about her award-winning 2020 book, The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. That book formed the basis for the documentary God and Country, produced last year by Michelle and Rob Reiner. At our convention last year, Katherine Stewart received FFRF's Free Thought Heroine Award, and at that time we asked Katherine to please come back this year to talk about her newest book, published this year, Money, Lies, and God, Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy. Money, Lies, and God is a deep and critical look into Christian nationalism, which not only explains the who's who of Christian nationalism, but how we got to this point where an organized political movement is working to destroy American democracy. Congressman Jamie Raskin calls Katherine's book an indispensable citizen's guide to the anti-democratic MAGA right in America. This sweeping account is, as one of her reviewers put it, is required reading for every person who wields a vote. Now, we have many pre-signed copies of her book here today, so please find one at our sales tables after Katherine's talk, and she will be doing the book signing at the end. For now, let's give a hand for Katherine. Katherine Stewart.
Thank you so much. It's how does that sound? It's just great to be here. I want to thank Annie, Lori, and Dan, and the entire staff of FFRF for hosting me for another fantastic convention. It just feels so good to be here. And I want to thank each and every one of you for joining together for these difficult but necessary and important, timely conversations. Before we get started, I'd really like to see a show of hands. How many of you guys have seen the ICE protesters dressed as alligators and frogs? There we go. How many of you guys have seen the, oh, thank you so much. How many of you guys have seen the, forgive me for saying aging hippie ukulele chorus? There's, yeah, exactly, you know. How about the naked bike ride in Portland? Yeah, I laugh too. It's funny because, as they say, Portland isn't a war zone. It's a bookstore surrounded by a coffee shop, then wrapped in a city. But what we're seeing today in America just isn't funny. Remember, Trump sold himself to the American electorate by promising to go after murderous gangsters, what he called the worst of the worst. It was just another lie. Last week, I spoke with an old friend, someone who I've known since childhood. He's a contractor. He fixes bathrooms and he builds out medical offices. He's a hardworking guy with a very hardworking crew. And you know what he told me? One of his colleagues was out on a job with 6 laborers. They were stopped by ICE, and ICE zip-tied the laborers. And they asked the guys where they lived, and if the guys wouldn't tell them, they looked in their wallets and figured it out. So they drove to their homes, and they zip-tied their wives, and then they zip-tied the children. They zip-tied the children. Most of these stories are not making the news, but a few managed to break through or get captured on video. A 7th grader kidnapped from his school, sent to a prison 500 miles away from his parents in another state, where he's sleeping on a concrete floor, housed with adults. A 14-year-old girl assaulted by masked men in an unmarked vehicle who push her to the ground and shove her face into the concrete. A 15-year-old American citizen locked in a garage for 5 hours without notifying his parents. Babies and children roused in the middle of the night, some of them not clothed and separated from their parents and zip-tied together. Meanwhile, the Trump family has enriched itself by over $3 billion in under a year. The administration is slashing American jobs and undermining workforce and consumer protections. And then, of course, there's the $20 billion bailout to Trump's buddies. Javier Milei, who's the president of Argentina, because he's one of Trump's buddies. And so these things might not seem that connected, right? Zip-tied children, bailouts for Trump's buddies to the tune of, 20 billion, or is it 40? It's like this huge amount of money, but it's your money and mine going for this, and the slashing of American jobs. These things might seem, and the corruption that we're seeing at the highest office. These things might seem unconnected, but they are actually connected. So I want to spend a few minutes connecting the dots about where we are today. And then I want to pivot to what we can and should be doing right now in response. The Trump administration's assault on democracy has entered a new and dangerous phase. He's doing exactly what he said he would do, and what many of us warned was coming. He is the head of a political movement that has long sought to destroy democracy, and he and his inner circle of supporters are now putting their destructive plans into motion. So let's connect those dots. Dot number one is the conversion of law enforcement and the system of justice into an instrument for punishing enemies of the regime and its leader. Consider the indictment of Trump's political opponents, including Letitia James, former FBI Director James Comey, just days after President Trump said that Attorney General Pam Bondi should prosecute them. He said, go after these guys, and she did. This radical action, by the way, it's not, let's just recall that when Nixon attempted to subvert the Department of Justice, his own political party, and it was leaked on secret tapes, his own political party got together and said, you can't do that, you're out. But this kind of radical action now is not surprising for a man who appointed many of his own personal defense attorneys to top positions within the Department of Justice. And it goes unremarked upon by his political party. Trump and his allies are sending the message that federal law enforcement is now a thoroughly political instrument of the leader and his ruling party. This is how corrupt autocracies work. It's not how democracies work, but it's how corrupt autocracies work. Dot number two, the executive order declaring Antifa a, quote, domestic terror organization. Now, even before the silly frogs started showing up at ICE facilities, the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian organization, they're hardly some group of woke lefties, right? The libertarians, they published an article pointing out that Antifa is not a formal organization. It's rather an idea, the way, like, I don't know, Taoism or going keto are ideas, right? They declared Trump's declaration about Antifa, quote, idiotic on multiple levels. And by the way, I already know that Antifa is not an organization, a political movement, because they don't send me 10 emails a day requesting donations, right? But the point of the order on Antifa is to follow through on the hateful rhetoric we're seeing from the highest office. The Trump administration intends to use the coercive power of federal government and federal law enforcement to attack any of those who disagree with its political views, on the pretext that to disagree with a ruler is to invite, quote, terrorism. Again, this is how corrupt autocracies work. In far-right Trumpland, they're calling tomorrow's No Kings protest a, quote, insurrection. I mean, they're desperately afraid of, soccer moms in Birkenstocks carrying homemade signs. But the point of dehumanizing Americans exercising a First Amendment right and pointing out we should have no kings because we had a revolution, so that we shouldn't have any kings. The whole point of that is to lay the groundwork for an authoritarian reaction. Remember, the Insurrection Act of 1807 means that the president can federalize National Guard and direct more law enforcement to suppress any dissent. So, with the administration's attack on the Soros-led Open Society Foundation and his vow to persecute other nonprofit organizations that happen to disagree with their agenda, with the MAGA agenda, the weaponization of the Department of Justice and the FBI is already underway. Dot number 3 is the deployment of the US military against so-called domestic enemies. This now includes various orders and declarations that make clear that Trump expects to use the military to apply coercive pressure against large sectors of the American population. The transformation of ICE into a federal police force largely outside of the traditional law enforcement apparatus is a connected part of that project. Dot number 4 is the conversion of sectors of the mainstream media into regime-compliant propaganda and disinformation providers. The big story is really the declaration long foretold that antitrust regulators now work not for the American public, but rather for the advance of Trump administration interests, which include the consolidation of America's mainstream media industry into the hands of a small number of Trump-supporting or Trump-boosting billionaires. We've got the sale of TikTok with the Trump-loving billionaire in charge. We've got the ongoing elevation of Fox News into the semi-official party state broadcast network and other data points. These complete the picture. You've got the creation of these media oligopolies that are going to impoverish and misinform the public. And this is exactly what authoritarians want. They love a misinformed public. They love a public separated from the facts because that makes them easier to control. Dot number 5 is the capture of the corporate sector. This has unfortunately proved a fairly easy part of the authoritarian project. You've got a number of CEOs, not entirely, but a number of CEOs trained in the shareholder value theory of management theory, and they're all too often pushovers for autocrats. They think, just point to the bottom line, and I'll give you their support in depriving the public of their rights. They have no clue that these autocrats are going to come back later to shake them down too. And we've already seen that happen with some of the media companies where they sort of cave in advance, and he's trying to do this with the universities too. They cave in advance, and then Trump comes back and said, oh yeah, and you've got to give me $20 million or whatever. Dot number 6, the reduction of the legislature to a plate of Jell-O. And as long as Republicans control both chambers of Congress, this mission is done and dusted. The Constitution places the power of the purse in Congress, right? This Republican Congress has handed it over, along with every other matter of substance, to the president, right? They talk about the unitary power of the executive, that's the president. This is why these protests have the term no kings, because we're not supposed to have a king. We're supposed to have a democratic government with checks and balances, where a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But this Congress isn't just wearing blindfolds. It has poked its own eyes out so it won't have to witness the epic levels of corruption and self-dealing at the highest office. It really makes, we've had corruption in the past, but I would say the Trump, family epic levels of self-enrichment make, Harding and his teapot domes look like child's play. And dot number 7, is to remove any opposition in the form of expertise by decimating the federal government. And this has been underway since Elon Musk, an unelected billionaire, and his 22-year-old minions rampaged through their federal government slashing and burning stuff in this very chaotic and ridiculous way. Many of the jobs they cut, like people who handle nuclear safety codes, later had to be reinstated. So what does this all have to do with religious nationalism? Well, America's Christian nationalist movement long preceded Donald Trump, and it will long outlast him. But make no mistake, this is the movement that brought Donald Trump to power. I'm not going to get into the weeds about it. I think most of you know what we're facing. As my friend Anthea Butler says, we're no longer in the warning stage, right? I've covered it at length in my 3 books. If you're interested in the topic, please, I'll be signing my latest, Money, Lies, and God, and I think also Power Worshippers, possibly. But it's worth noting that much of the Christian nationalist movement functions as a giant voter turnout machine. And that machinery did play a critical role in putting Trump in office. You know, I want to shift just a little bit now and talk about authoritarianism. I want to suggest that sometimes it's misunderstood. Authoritarianism, just like Christian nationalism, is not a full-fledged political program that every single member of the rank and file who lends their support to it endorses. It's sort of more of a political dynamic that takes over a political system. And a lot of the folks involved aren't really aware of the, I would say, collective consequences of their actions. So it's something that can happen to a nation. And the attack on democracy we're seeing now unfolding in the US is therefore best not seen as a work of any single ideology, but as a kind of pathology. In my latest book, I show the attack is hitting us along 3 fronts: money, lies, and God, by which I mean the exploitation of religion. I want to start with the last word in my title, God. When I use that word, of course, I'm not talking about any particular single religion or any particular theology by itself. What I'm really referring to is a political use or appropriation of certain kinds of religion. Remember, there are people of many different denominations and religious approaches involved in funding the movement, in organizing it, and also in mobilizing the rank and file. So in the American, so it really is about like the suppression of or denigration of certain kinds of religion and the elevation of others, the suppression or denigration of any interpretation of faith that emphasizes love, compassion, care, and empathy, and the elevation of types of religion that emphasize obedience, conformity, and punishment. And it's an us versus them mentality. And it's the idea that hierarchies are supposedly ordained of God. Religious nationalism in its extreme form is an authoritarian's best friend. You know, organizations like Freedom House and the World Population Review, they have maps that score different countries on their measures of freedom. There's some variation among the scores, but broadly speaking, the maps show that countries that are the most religious nationalist are overrepresented as the most unfree. Discrimination against women, against sexual minorities, against religious minorities, and other disfavored groups is endemic. Journalists are censored or persecuted. Political opposition is squelched. Unsurprisingly, these countries are the most oligarchic and corrupt, and these things are linked. You know, if we examine these countries, they're not exactly theocracies, properly speaking. There's, of course, an official religion, and the government attempts to impose those religious values on everybody. But these countries are better described as cronyistic kleptocracies with absolute suppression of free speech and political opposition. And so religious nationalism is just one among several tools. Why do authoritarians love religious nationalism so much? Part of it is distraction. If you can get a population divided amongst themselves, squabbling about culture war issues, and outrage, focused on outrage politics, then you give them scapegoats they can blame for their problems. They're not going to look for the real sources of their problems. They're not going to look at the corruption of their leaders. They won't notice the leaders are enriching themselves and their friends at the public's expense. The other part is fear. More specifically, it's about giving people an enemy so vile and hateful that all measures against it are imperative. It's about creating a sense of crisis. We're seeing this in our administration today, saying wokeism, whatever that is, equality, is an emergency. And therefore, any breaking of the rules, any violation of norms is justified in defeating this terrible enemy. So I want to talk very quickly about, that's sort of the God part of my title, Money, Lies, and God. So I want to talk about the money part. Let's consider a few statistics. The amount of wealth created for the 19 richest American families in 2024 is $1 trillion. Since 2005, the bottom 90% of America has owned less than the top 1% of Americans. Since 1933, the decline in the average tax rate for the top 0.1 Americans is at least 50%, probably a bit more since Trump took office. Meanwhile, the increase in the average tax rate for the bottom 90% in that same period is 150%. So most of us, I don't know, in this room perhaps, our tax rate has increased 150%. Meanwhile, the top 0.1, their rate has decreased by 50%. Over the past decades, we've seen a massive concentration of wealth upward, right, at the tippy top of the economic ladder, a hollowing out of the middle and working classes. This leads to a lot of dissatisfaction and anger, and people are really confused about it. They're not walking around with these statistics in their heads. They're just wondering why their lives are so difficult. So people have legitimate grievances, real grievances, and movement leaders are really good at harnessing those grievances and blaming scapegoats for them. Often the story of rising inequality is framed as one of fairness. It just seems unfair that a few people get to have so many mega yachts, while the rest of us have to either sink or swim, right? But the big issue, as far as I'm concerned, isn't just about fairness. It's about power. The kind of inequality we have now means giving tremendous amounts of power to people who happen to hold oligarchic wealth. We've seen billions of dollars flowing into the infrastructure of the Christian nationalist movement and the anti-democratic movement. Most of it has come from a sector of extremely wealthy individuals and family foundations. America has a lot of rich people, and some of them do invest their money in really positive initiatives in an effort to make life better for all Americans. But there's a relatively small but significant sector that is investing it in the think tanks and policy groups, networking organizations, and the like that make up this anti-democratic movement. We're sort of limited for space here, so I want to sort of wrap up fairly quickly. But before I get to sort of I have like we talked about connecting the dots for where we are today, and we're going to talk about connecting the dots for solutions. But I think before I do that, I want to say that like the third piece of the Money, Lies, and God is really about the war and the truth, right? The lies. Some of these big donors are investing in disinformation operations so the public won't figure out how badly they're being screwed. And, Frederick Douglass said, I'm paraphrasing here, he said, "Tyrants fear nothing more than free speech, because truth is the great enemy of all oppressors. When truth is in peril, democracy is in peril." If religious nationalism is an authoritarian's best friend, the control of the media and the suppression of critical voices are among its favorite tools. Look at Russia, Hungary, Turkey. Let's look at China. These and other oppressive governments have converted information media into disinformation and propaganda. They manipulate and control people by separating them from the facts. I do want to talk about where we go next. Now is not the time to curl up in despair. You know who I heard that from? I heard that from Steve Bannon. I heard that after the 2024 election. And I was at a gathering, 20,000 hardcore MAGA supporters at the Phoenix Convention Center. This was the angriest group of winners I've ever seen. Steve Bannon gets up there and he said, when you lost in 2020, you didn't get into bed and suck your thumbs. You got out there and you decided to fight. And he's right, you know. I mean, they did things we would never want to do. We would never want to inspire or organize political violence, engage in political violence. We would never want to spread disinformation and lies. But there's a lot we can do, and I think we would do well to take note of their determination. So here's where we go next. We've got institutions to protect, pro-democracy organizations to support, lawsuits to pursue, corruption to expose, and midterm elections in about a year's time. The same forces that brought us the anti-democratic movement have succeeded in undermining our key institutions, so we need to fight for them. We need to explain to people the importance of the judiciary, the integrity of religious institutions, and the fact that many of them have been turned into partisan political cells. They've eroded the guardrails of one of our two political parties. We need to learn how these institutions have been undermined and then communicate to others how they've been undermined and commit ourselves to the process of restoring them. So it takes time for the autocrat to consolidate control. Someone once described this to me. They said that the concrete has been poured or is being poured, but it hasn't hardened yet. It's really important. So it takes time for we're still free to have conversations and gatherings like these, for instance. So it's important to focus on strategic and broad-based actions. We need to turn out the base. I think the reason why, frankly, the 2024 election worked out the way it did is because of disproportionate voting on one side of the political aisle and underrepresented voting on the other. Two, it's really important to work with like-minded organizations, even if you don't agree on everything. This is really important. You know, to paraphrase the father of Ronald Reagan, the person who agrees with you 80% of the time is your 80% friend, not your 20% enemy. We would do well to heed that advice, because they do. They say there's no victory without unity. You know, we can and should collaborate with those who share at least a majority of our goals. None of us are going to get everything we want, but if we can agree on more than we disagree on, we can and we should work together. Number three, some basic democratic principles. We can and should work together. So we need to build the infrastructure of a pro-democracy movement at all levels. There are things we can do as individuals, like vote and create circles, democracy circles, where we engage in activities, where we encourage others to vote and get active, and things that we can do better together when we join with others. Four, we need to work with, to educate others about the forces at work. A lot of this filters to the local level, so it's really important to be locally engaged, to build networks of support and kindness and mutual aid, to get involved in local governance, school boards, public libraries, etc. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, but there is no shortage of avenues for productive engagement. And six, finally, in conclusion, I want to say there is nothing more meaningful than being part of a struggle for democracy. It is action that gives us hope. America can survive the next years if we can get ourselves active and just step it up a little bit and stand up for our country. It really won't be easy, and there are no guarantees. Freedom isn't a guarantee when you look at the sweep of history, but I bet every single one of you in this room can think, maybe you don't know them, but I bet every single one of you, or most of you, have an ancestor who in some point in the world, in some part of the world, at some time in history, in some way, had to struggle for their freedom against the odds. If they could do it, we must try, and we owe it not just to ourselves, but to future generations. Thank you so much.